Lizzie had mentioned something about the board being organized, which is, not my kind of inclination. But I do want to point out, like, I think you can notice at every start of the video how clean the board is, because Fred, Jan, and Renee are coming in and, basically cleaning up my mess after me, and, then I haven't gotten the chance to thank them in person, but it's just another sort of, in relation to all this and in relation to the things that you've been talking about that Isaac has sort of brought up, it's just a sobering reminder that, that people are working right now and putting themselves at immense risk, right? And, I see students here and there, and it's like the building is kind of, I imagine there would be people working, still, but, like other faculty, crazily enough, there really isn't on campus. But just a reminder that, there are students on campus that are here. There are people that are helping them, so, like just trying to come back to that with all of that sort of in mind in relation to things that we've already been talking about, right? So let's get to the Kush Varia, the introduction. Bollywood, what's all the song and the dance about history and industry. This is the much more critical piece than the piece that we'll be reading on Thursday, and the much more kind of informative piece. So, Varia begins with talking about so the conventions or motifs of Indian cinema are often what are kind of the real sort of point of fascination for a lot of people, in the sense that, especially the sort of song and dance, right, or the length of the films, or the kind of beats that they hit and that they tend to hit. And it's very easy for us to kind of look at them and say, like, why do they do it that way? But again, the critical shift is to say, it's so easy for me to look at that and say, that looks strange. But we should turn around and say why. It's not necessarily just to say, the first move is to just say, well, maybe other people will look at my stuff and think that's strange too. Interesting. That's not enough. You have to be like, why do I take for granted, or why do I assume that my stuff is normal? How does this dichotomy get set up? It's historical, right? It's not, again, the kind of bad move to make is that, well, that's just how it is. That's the correct framework. Theirs is weird, mine is correct. Like that's not how we want to go about all this, right? So the conventions and the attitudes towards the conventions. This is a kind of recurring theme that we've seen so far throughout the semester, and I think just through cinema in general, but a real idea of negotiation. Meaning, like cinema, it's like the, what is it? One of those kind of sayings, like, be brave enough to change the things that you want. Like, I'm going to butcher this, and then also be brave enough to accept the things that you don't want. That's a process. Like, that doesn't just come. You don't just accept that, this is how things are going to be. Oh, there's nothing I can do. You have to kind of work through it. And that goes through, again, like these, collectively, nationally, right? So culture becomes a site to kind of reconcile, grapple with, fight against, or learn to kind of accept, like broad kind of things that are happening, and cinema is no different. And as a technology and a medium and an art that emerges at a massive sort of point of change, of sort of socio-historical change, namely like, industrialization and modernity, this tends to be like one of the major sites where we see, especially historically, this is on page 1, just this kind of negotiation. This is especially interesting, so, because what Varia will say on page 1 is that it's a negotiation between tradition and modernity. Now, immediately, my mind goes to that this is the same case in Asia. East Asia specifically, because this is South Asia, right? So it's Asia, it's still Asia, right? So we're thinking about like Korea, Japan, China, and where like sort of kind of East Asian historical Confucian ideas are kind of really clashing or sort of being negotiated against more kind of whatchamacallit, kind of modern industrial ideas. And the thing is that this is true, but it's similar to what I was just saying about normal and abnormal, or normal and what we consider abnormal, is that there's a way in which, like, the antiquity of the East is sort of baked in, as if this is something that's like ongoing. And so immediately I think, like, why don't we have this in the U.S.? As if, which is not true. Like, even in American cinema, I mean, that's why she'll later talk about early film history. There is a grappling with modernity, but there's a way in which, like, it's almost as if it's a grappling with modernity, but not necessarily with kind of like historical traditions, right? Because we're a country that's not that old, right? But then you think about places like Europe, and is that not the case? It's like, of course it's the case. These are also places that have thousands of years of history, and yet there's a way in which we assume that this sort of central kind of problem is really, like, particular to certain parts of the world, whereas like other places like Europe, they've already figured it out, or it's like, they've always been modern and hip, enlightened, right? That's what we're really getting to, because, like, of course we can't avoid colonialism. So cinema offers, for Varia, Indian cinema, what's sort of important is that it offers opportunities for unconventional socio-cultural discussion, right? Not the sort of, standard kind of conversations and discussions that can be had, but also unconservative solutions. Like, conservatism is a sort of central kind of question throughout both readings, throughout what's being said about like Indian negotiation through cinema. In a sense of, like, meaning sort of, kind of, if we think temporally, like conserving, right, tradition, as opposed to kind of progressing towards modernity. And again, me personally, especially when we're talking about those terms kind of mainstream politically, I'm of the mind that both sides have to figure things out, and that both sides are actually on the same side in ways that people don't really like to talk about or don't really want to think about. So that's in this sense we're certainly talking politically too, but a little bit more kind of culturally and historically. I like that Varia talks about how we have, when we're approaching these kind of international cinemas, and again, I've talked about it before, but even the rhetorical shift where we don't really say foreign cinema anymore, but international cinema, right? Is this kind of like, a sort of impulse for cultural explanation. So this impulse kind of reveals things about the way that we kind of approach, quote unquote, other cultures. It's almost as if like we're always looking for almost like a kind of like a pathology, right? So if we think about something like, how come the British drive on, the wrong side of the road, quote unquote? Well, that's because X, Y, and Z, right? There's something in the people that correlates to that. How come the Japanese are so quiet? Well, that's because culturally, da-da-da-da-da. It's that kind of impulse that Varia is critical of and even suspicious of, and I'm the same. And again, it's because it's just one of these things where it seems harmless and we do it all the time, but if you kind of get to what it is at its core, which is this idea as if that these sort of specificities or particularities of a group or an individual are contingent and dependent on the context, but rather something that's like baked into them, that can get really ugly really quickly. It's not a line of reasoning that I would like to make personally. It's not a line of reasoning that I like when it's made against me personally. And I try and live in a way and try to teach in a way where we don't we don't do that, where we do things that benefit us, but don't like it when they don't benefit us. That's just not. It's not fair. It's not consistent. It's just not. I don't think the best way to live. Right. You want to be consistent and constant. And so that's what she's what Varia is kind of pointing out, is the sort of tendency, right, to kind of like essential. I mean, basically, it's a form of essentialism, right? So like we can understand Indian cinema by looking at ancient drama, like Indian dramaturgy, right? Like there's this clear line, and if we go back to Fassbender, if the problem with this kind of like teleology and this sort of like narrativizing is that it effaces it, it kind of erases and glosses over the ruptures and the points, like the breaks and the points when other things are kind of coming in, as if there's just like one uncontested clean line, and that's just not true. That's just not how history works, right? And Varia points out that this is a stretch for two reasons. For one, that Indian dramaturgy was never mainstream, so this is a very mainstream form. So to say that there's like a clear connection, that one comes directly out of the other, is just not true, right? And two, by the time that cinema is concerned, like ancient dramaturgy has basically been all but forgotten. So when, this is the kind of convenient research that we don't want to be doing, where it's like you have this sort of cultural explanation in your head. I bet you that we can find an understanding of Indian cinema by looking at ancient Indian narrative, ignore all of the history in between, find some sort of connection, and conveniently put it together. I'll just say it straight. It's like, it's not good scholarship, right? So against this, which is what Varia points out is the kind of like convenient, unreal, not real history, the real history is that it's just like, for India, it was just like really anywhere else where it's between industrialization, this is page 2, industrialization and new technologies. And this is why Dunning's monumental and crucial, one of the most, certainly in film history, but in film studies in general, one of the most important articles and pieces of research in his argument about the cinema of attractions, which is entirely about how initially, cinema was entirely about itself and not necessarily about the story or about the entertainment. And then this all has to do with modernity and the sort of turn to modernity, right? But that people were kind of there to sort of experience the technology itself too, like the spectacle of the technology, right? And Varia is basically saying that this is the case for India as well. And so this is, again, like another kind of great example of, strong research where it seems to be only about, the US in a particular moment, but it has explanatory power for other places in the world as well. Okay, moving on.